Welcome back to our deep dive into corruption in China. We're on the third part now. If you remember, in the first two parts, we went deep into how corruption in China changed. We traced it from the 1980s all the way to now. We saw how it went from petty theft and extortion to a more complex system of exchange. And we learned how the CCP tried to control certain types of corruption, especially those types that were really holding back their economic growth. In this final part, we're focusing on a sector with really high stakes, China's military. We're going to explore how corruption affects their ability to innovate and what that means for their goals of becoming a world power.
It really is a fascinating puzzle, isn't it? China's military has come a long way in modernizing and advancing its technology, but it's operating in a system where corruption is everywhere. So how do these two things exist together? And what does it mean for China's future as a major military power?
Exactly. And that's why you're back with us, to help us figure this out. Now, I remember from our previous conversations that not all corruption is the same. You've done some amazing research on this, and you developed something called the Unbundled Corruption Index, or UCI. Can you remind us what this index showed about corruption in China?
Absolutely. The UCI breaks down corruption into different types. It helps us see a more detailed picture. What we found is that China scores very high in what we call access money. This isn't your typical bribe. It's more about businesses offering big rewards to powerful officials. They do this in exchange for exclusive privileges and opportunities. It's like buying your way into a system where connections matter more than merit.
So it's more than just greasing the wheels. It's about getting a real advantage. But how does this access money actually work in China's military-industrial complex? I mean, we're talking about national security, huge amounts of money, and cutting-edge technology.
You're right. And because the stakes are so high in the military sector, the potential rewards for corruption are huge. We've seen lots of cases where military officials have been caught taking bribes from defense contractors. They do this to get those big contracts. It's basically access money on a massive scale, and it has a huge impact on innovation.
Okay, so let's talk about innovation. We know China has been putting a lot of resources into modernizing its military. They want to be a global military power. But if this access money is everywhere, how does it affect their ability to actually innovate?
Well, think about it. If companies know they can get contracts by bribing the right people, rather than by having the best technology, what's their motivation to really innovate? Why invest in research and development if you can just buy your way to the top?
That's a really good point. It's like taking a shortcut that avoids the whole process of real innovation. But what are the companies that do want to innovate? How does this system affect them?
It creates a very uneven playing field.
Those who are willing to be corrupt have a big advantage.
They can use their connections to get funding, resources, and special treatment. This pushes out potential competitors who might actually have better ideas.
So it's not just about a few bad apples getting ahead. It's about the whole system becoming less dynamic and less competitive. And in the long run, that could really hurt China's ability to compete, especially with other military powers who are investing heavily in cutting-edge technology.
Exactly. Corruption within the military-industrial complex can hold back innovation in several ways. First, it can mess up how resources are allocated. Instead of funding the most promising and innovative projects, the money might go to projects favored by corrupt officials, whether they're good projects or not.
So it comes down to who you know, not what you know, even when it comes to developing weapon systems and military technology.
Sadly, yes, that's often the case. And this wrong allocation of resources can have a domino effect on the whole system. If the wrong projects get the money, it can slow down innovation and stop the development of really groundbreaking technologies.
It's like trying to build a house on a foundation that's not stable. You might make some progress, but eventually those weaknesses will catch up to you. But let's switch gears a bit and talk about investment. How does corruption within the military affect investment, both from inside China and from other countries?
Corruption makes investors feel uncertain and at risk. If contracts are given out based on bribes instead of merit, it's really hard to predict which projects will succeed and which will fail. This unpredictability makes investors nervous about putting their money in. They don't want to invest in a system that might be rigged against them.
So it's more than just wasted resources and inefficient spending. It's about damaging the whole idea of a healthy market economy, one that's built on trust, transparency, and fairness.
Exactly. And when trust is eroded, it can really discourage investment, both from inside China and internationally. It makes the system seem opaque, unpredictable, and potentially corrupt. And that makes it less attractive to invest in China's military modernization.
So we've painted a pretty negative picture. But is there any hope for change? Can China break free from this cycle of corruption and its negative effects on innovation and investment?
That's the big question, isn't it? And it's one that we'll explore more in the next part of our deep dive.
I'm really looking forward to hearing your thoughts on that. But before we move on, I think it's important to connect this back to the bigger picture. We've been talking about corruption and innovation within China's military, but why should our listener care about this? What's the relevance for someone who might not be a military expert or a China scholar?
That's a great question. And the answer is that this issue goes way beyond China. China's military ambitions are global. They want to be a dominant force in Asia and project power around the world. Whether their military modernization efforts succeed or fail, and remember, this is closely tied to the issue of corruption, it will have a huge impact on the global balance of power.
So it's not just an internal Chinese matter. It affects all of us.
Exactly. The choices China's leaders make about corruption and innovation in their military will have ripple effects that will be felt globally.
This is fascinating, and I'm already eager to hear what you have to say in the next part, but for now, we'll leave our listener with this thought. If China wants to achieve its military goals, it needs to deal with corruption head-on. It needs to find ways to encourage real innovation, create a level playing field, and rebuild trust in the system. Otherwise, their ambitions might be stopped by the very things that have helped them rise.
Right. It's crucial to understand that corruption isn't just an ethical issue for China. It directly affects their ability to innovate. And that has implications for global security as well.
It's definitely something to think about, and it makes our next conversation even more important. But for now, we'll leave it there. We'll be back soon to continue this deep dive, so stay tuned. So we just talked about how this access money can really distort things, how it discourages real innovation in China's military. But it's kind of strange, isn't it? China's economy and technology have grown so much. Even with all this corruption, how is that possible?
Yeah, it's important to understand how corruption in China evolved. It wasn't always about this access money back in the 80s and 90s. When market reforms were just starting, things were much more chaotic. Think of local officials demanding bribes just to let businesses operate, or just slapping on random fines and fees. It made things really unpredictable for businesses.
So it was more like the Wild West of corruption. Less organized, more opportunistic. How did it shift towards this access money model we see today?
Well, a few things happened at the same time. First, after 1993, markets grew really fast. There was just more money flowing around, so the potential rewards for corruption got much bigger. Second, around 1998, the central government started focusing on building up their administrative capacity. They introduced reforms to standardize budgets, keep track of public finances, and to discourage these more transactional forms of corruption. They were basically trying to control the chaos, and to some extent, they did.
Interesting. So they actually managed to curb certain types of corruption, but access money kind of slipped through the cracks.
Right. It has to do with how the Chinese bureaucracy works. Officials are often rewarded based on financial performance. The better a region or sector does financially, the more they benefit. So they're incentivized to prioritize economic growth, even if it means turning a blind eye to corrupt practices like access money, or even participating in them. It becomes a vicious cycle.
So short-term gains are more important, even if it sacrifices long-term stability or fairness. And this plays right into the hands of those trying to buy influence in the military-industrial complex.
Exactly. This system creates weaknesses that can be exploited. Imagine a defense contractor who knows they can get a big contract by offering access money to the right official. Even if their technology isn't the best, they can still get a foothold in the market, and that pushes out potential competitors who might actually be more innovative.
It's like a distorted kind of natural selection, where those who are best at working the corrupt system thrive, even if it holds back real progress. Let's get into specifics. How does this impact innovation in the military?
One major consequence is that research and development priorities get messed up. If funding decisions are based on corruption, the money might go to projects that benefit corrupt officials, not necessarily the projects with the most scientific potential.
So instead of going for cutting-edge technology that could give China a real advantage, they might be stuck with outdated or inferior systems. Just because of some backroom deal. That's a huge risk, especially when it comes to national defense.
Absolutely. And it's not just about having less effective weapons. This type of corruption can create a culture where everyone just accepts things the way they are. It can lead to stagnation in research and development. If scientists and engineers know that connections matter more than innovation, they're less likely to push boundaries or try new things.
It's creating a system where mediocrity thrives and true innovation is stifled. But wouldn't China's leaders see this? Surely they understand the long-term risks.
Of course, they know there's a problem. Xi Jinping has made fighting corruption a key part of his agenda. His anti-corruption campaign has been huge, targeting both high-level officials and lower-level bureaucrats.
Right, the tigers and the flies.
Exactly. But the challenge is finding a way to get rid of corruption without completely undermining the system that brought China to where it is today.
It's like walking a tightrope.
Yeah.
You want to eliminate corruption without paralyzing the system with fear. How do you do that? What concrete steps can China take to address this within the military-industrial complex?
Well, one important strategy is to shift away from just punishment. Right now, the anti-corruption campaign is mostly driven by fear. Officials are terrified of getting caught and punished, so they're playing it safe, avoiding any decisions that could be seen as risky or corrupt. This can lead to what we call lazy governance, where officials are so afraid of making a mistake that they don't make any decisions at all.
So how do you move away from this culture of fear? How do you create a system where officials are encouraged to be proactive and innovative, but without opening the door to more corruption?
I think the key is to build a stronger system of checks and balances, one that emphasizes transparency, accountability, and the rule of law, rather than just relying on fear.
So less stick and more sunlight, as they say.
Exactly. One concrete step would be to strengthen the role of independent auditing and oversight bodies within the military. Right now, there's not much transparency when it comes to military spending and procurement.
So there's not much external scrutiny of how these decisions are made, which makes it easier for corruption to thrive.
Precisely. Increasing transparency, allowing for independent audits, and creating ways for whistleblowers to come forward without fear. Those things could go a long way in making the system more accountable.
That makes sense. But we often think of China as a very top-down, authoritarian system. Is there really any desire for this kind of transparency and accountability within the Chinese military? It seems like that would go against their entire political culture.
It's a good point, and it's definitely a challenge, but I think there's a growing realization among China's leaders that unchecked corruption is a serious threat to their long-term goals.
Because it's not just about a few corrupt officials getting rich. It's about weakening the foundations of their military power.
Exactly. And I think there are some signs that they're starting to take this seriously. For example, there's been a push to make the military more professional, to instill a stronger sense of ethics and accountability.
So it's about changing the culture from within, not just relying on external pressure or top-down enforcement.
Precisely. And this is a long-term process. It won't happen overnight. But I think it's necessary if China wants to achieve its military ambitions. They need a system where innovation is rewarded, where the best people rise to the top, and where corruption is seen as a threat to national security, not just a cost of doing business.
These are really important points. They give us a lot to think about as we go into the final part of our deep dive. But before we do that, let's bring our listener back into the conversation. We've been talking about some pretty complex stuff: corruption, innovation, military modernization, all within China's unique political system.
Yeah, it's a lot to take in.
It is. So for our listener who might be feeling a bit overwhelmed, what's the one key takeaway you want them to remember from this part of our discussion? What's the most important point we've covered so far?
I think the most important thing to remember is that corruption in China's military isn't just an ethical issue or just a matter of good governance. It's a strategic weakness, one that could undermine their ability to compete globally.
Because it directly affects their ability to innovate and develop the technology they need to achieve their military goals.
Exactly. And that has implications for everyone, not just China.
Absolutely. And with that in mind, we'll take a short break and come back for the final part of our deep dive. We'll explore whether China can break free from this cycle of corruption and what that might mean for the future of global power.